back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Quick introduction to my next guest. My socialist mother, my dad was more of a liberal Democrat. My socialist mother raised me with stories of Vito Marcantonio, who was, when she and my father lived in New York City, the only socialist member of the United States Congress, self-declared, elected in the American Labor Party, originally as a Republican, oddly enough, and then Labor Party and so on. But she regaled me with stories of Marcantonio and of socialists who had won mayoral offices around the world. I think she believed, as most people believed in those days, we would never again see socialist elected officials in the United States. But times have changed. That's why I immediately signed up to work with Bernie Sanders in 2016, a Democratic Socialist candidate. We all know how that went. I also revitalized Democratic Socialists of America. My next guest is the deputy director of what is called the DSA Fund, which is the educational arm of Democratic Socialists for America. They recently sponsored a conference of elected socialist and Democratic Socialist officials entitled How We Win. As I told the folks at DSA, I really wanted to talk about that for a variety of reasons, including I hate negativity and I love positivity. And so I love the whole angle of this. So here to discuss that with us now is Sunshine Royanian Ludder. Sunshine, as I said, is the deputy director of the DSA Fund, the educational arm, and she was instrumental in putting this conference together. So first of all, Sunshine, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here with you.
Well, we're glad to have you. And if you don't mind just giving us a brief rundown on what this conference was and how it came to be, we'd appreciate it.
Sure, happy to. Well, so first of all, it was convened, we co-convened it, we being the DSA Fund, along with The Nation and Jacobin. So all three organizations came together about a year or so ago with the idea of bringing together, now that, as you said, so many more elected officials are in office from the last, 5, 7, 8 years of work on the ground across the country, both from DSA chapters, from allied groups, allied organizers and activists around the country, to really, not only bring in federal elected officials such as Bernie Sanders or Cori Bush and, lots of new members, but also at the local, city and state level. And we kind of recognized and realized that a lot of folks have been getting into office, but often they feel isolated, or they're by themselves in a city or town somewhere, or they have a small cohort, but they don't really know maybe what's going on in other parts of their region or across the country. So we all came together with the idea of, okay, now that there's a really substantial number of folks in office who are declared Democratic Socialists or endorsed by local DSA chapters or the national DSA, we would like to bring them together to kind of, give each other mutual support, have a sense of ownership and belonging to a larger group of fellow peers on the left. And hopefully that this conference would be really the first step in a larger project in that regard, where they can share resources, have mutual support, et cetera, that we can be supportive of. And it was really great to be able to bring people together in person, of course, especially after the last few years when we were really holding off on any kind of in-person activities. And folks really appreciated it. I mean, over the course of last weekend, so many folks, just walked up and were like, I really needed this. I really needed to be with my fellow peers who understand what I'm going through, who understand the challenges that I face. So excited to stay in touch with each other. So that was really the idea. And our sense is that folks really got what they needed out of it. So we're very happy and excited about that. And also to start thinking about how to kind of build forward and continue that support.
It's interesting, Sunshine, excuse me, because was Summer Lee there? Maybe that's why I made that mistake.
It actually happens quite often. The summer sunshine, I think, are the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
place for people.
Sorry
Yeah,
about that. Yeah.
no problem.
Was Summer Lee there?
She wasn't. I know she, like many others, also wanted to be there who had obviously freestanding conflicts, et cetera. And that was also part of the excitement from folks, both folks who couldn't be there, who were like, "Oh, I really want to be there. Let me know when there's another opportunity, et cetera." And also from some of the people who were present, who were like, "Oh, I really need to bring in my colleague so and
Yeah.
so into this conversation." So yeah, she wasn't present, but hopefully in the future, she's another kind of person who would be.
One of the things that interests me about this conference is it takes a special kind of person to run for office. I don't think I fit that mold for. When Bernie hired me, we went out to dinner, and I was his writer, and he said, "I like writing. Why don't you run for president, and I'll be the writer?" And I said, "I don't have the temperament to run for office." And he gave me a look for a second, like, is this guy like insulting me? And it's like, no, 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 I really don't. So people who do, I really admire that combination of skill and tenacity. And, it makes them special. But it seems to me one of the things that makes them special is that they really like. Bernie talked about this all the time, like with student groups or people asked him how to get into politics. He said, you really need to like talking to people about the issues. And obviously other people take other paths to political power, as Bernie is well aware. But were these people who fit that mold? Were these people who just really liked to talk about the issues to everyone they meet? I know I'm asking you to generalize, but was that basically the sense you had?
Yeah, I mean, to what you just said, I wouldn't want to speak for everyone or generalize too much. And I think, people do kind of come at elected office in different ways and follow different strategies. I would say, yes, a lot of folks there, they're really focused on making folks' everyday lives better, really focused on changing those things in a structural way, right? From working class interests, representing working class interests, and then actually winning for working class people, for their constituents, which is why we called it How We Win, moving a democratic socialist policy agenda in office. So I would say, yes, that was definitely a common theme for, the elected officials there, especially because, folks were primarily, and our goal was to bring people together who are in local office and state level office, who, for better or for worse, this was discussed at the weekend. Of course, at the federal level, it's really hard to move things right now, as we know. But there are much more, space and opportunities at a lot of local and state levels. So yeah, I would say, definitely a big issue orientation in the sense of how can we really get things done that make a real difference in the structural power of our locality or our state, and also really change the lived experience of people in our lives.
And Sunshine, you bring up an important point, which is how we win in this case is not how we win elections, right? It's how we win on the policy level. It's how we get policies passed. I would assume that, but correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the people who came, most of the elected folks who came, are in a small minority, even if, whether they're for example, if they're in a legislature or the Congress or state Senate or what have you, may be different for mayors and so on and city council members, but that they're in the minority in terms of their political views. Is that true?
Yes, I think, right. For the most part, we know that right now, being a democratic socialist, being, on the left is generally a minority position in government in the United States, across basically everywhere, even the most, progressive states. And I would say so that was definitely part of folks' orientation, our orientation is what are the strategies to function, govern effectively, and move an agenda from a minority position, right? And folks talked a lot about how they work with, folks who consider themselves progressive but don't consider themselves socialist in terms of their peers in office, how to bring folks along, how to, figure out how to build some of those coalitions where more things can get passed. And of course, we had people who are in very different positions, right? We had folks who had a real cohort of like-minded peers. I mean, I think New York State is a very, within the DSA framework, a very, obvious example of a fairly developed cohort of Democratic Socialists in office at the state level, really working closely together, as well as at the city level now. But, there's other cohorts in, Chicago. There's, we had quite a bit of representation from Pennsylvania, actually in Philadelphia, which was very exciting. So there were different places where there are these cohorts who I think are seen some of these opportunities and building on some of these opportunities to work with, if you want to call it the progressive Democrats in their, various bodies. And then, of course, there's folks who are really kind of, solo out there and having to figure out where can they move things or have influence on specific pieces of the work. Maybe it's, implementation. Maybe it's a piece of regulatory thing that has more impact than anyone realizes that they can kind of move through. So yeah, I think everyone's in the position mostly of governing from a minority position. And there's part of that's part of the conversation is how do we strategically learn from each other's successes in that, challenges, where folks might have seen an opportunity that others might be able to think about in their respective, location. So yes.
So, and when you say progressive in this context, I assume you mean, the standard kind of I'm a progressive who gets things done, right? It's centrist kind of center left, and so that's one challenge: is how do you build alliances with the center left if you're in a Democratic majority legislature, let's say, or city council. And maybe we can circle back at some point and talk a little bit more about that. The other, obviously, is if you're in a red state or red majority group, where I would think, but correct me if I'm wrong, your main function there is probably just to introduce ideas so they get into a political mix a little bit. But you tell, what do people do? Did you have people who were in that situation? How did they decide to handle it?
Yeah, we definitely had people in that situation, which was something I was really hoping for in terms of this gathering, that we had people from, again, using these broadly popular terms, like we had people from, quote unquote, red, purple, blue states or, localities, and also from like very small town to large metro area, different kinds of geographic contexts and demographic contexts of where they lived. I think I don't have all the answers to that. And since we just came through this 2-day gathering, I have a lot to learn from folks going forward in terms of what you're saying, how they're managing that, how they're handling that. But yeah, I think definitely I can think of somebody in particular who I had some good conversations with about how they really worked a lot with unions in the area, for example, as a constituency that already had existing infrastructure in local government, like contracting, for example, through the local city government that had been longstanding, even if it was now a relatively red place. So in terms of who was in government. So if some of those kind of infrastructure, political infrastructure kind of predates maybe some of the more recent political changes, for example, in a place, or becoming more radically right, there were opportunities to build with those existing structures like local unions, for example. Right. So that was one thing that came up. And then another thing that came up that, Bernie Sanders also really highlighted in the keynote he gave to the conference, as well as we were fortunate enough to have Congresswoman Cori Bush also speak to the gathering. But, Bernie Sanders, which I think he often does, he really emphasized, work with your constituents on their bread and butter day-to-day issues. If you're fixing the, local after-school program, if you're fixing this, if you're fixing that, you can start to build that support more broadly with your constituencies, not only in your own particular district, but maybe more broadly in the city as a whole. And then the other thing that was really talked about was, especially for, some of the electeds, it might be their first term in office, or, generally speaking, they're relatively new to the position they're in terms of operating in a government body and office. So there was also a lot of talk about how do we bring along a second or third or fourth person in a nearby district, so that we do have somebody to work with. And there were places where there had been one person and now there are two, or things like that. So that was also part of the conversation for folks in that position, was how do we bring along the next person that's going to be our ally?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Sunshine, let me ask you, I assume, even in the so-called red states, cities tend to be blue or whatever. And so, Jackson, Mississippi, extremely progressive city, Memphis, Tennessee, we could go on. Was there much, if any, rural representation, were the vast majority of folks from urban areas?
Yeah, I will have to go back and look at our groupings in terms of the question of rural. We definitely had places where folks were representing much smaller cities, or maybe even called towns, depending on the locality. We also definitely had suburban. Whether or not we had truly rural, I'm not 100% sure. And that would be something that we would definitely follow up on as we're starting to understand, exactly all the different pieces of where folks were coming from, who were in attendance going forward, as well as, like I said, folks who wanted to come but couldn't be there for that particular gathering. And it is a good question in terms of are there already folks that are in truly rural areas? Since we're talking about the nation as a whole, I don't have everyone in my head,
sure.
But I'm not sure if we had truly rural representation.
Well, that's fair. I mean, I think one of the issues that must come up, especially, it's interesting because if you talk about, first of all, it may be most impressive that people get elected in with this kind of politics in suburban areas, because urban areas, you're going to have a strong left population. Suburban, you've got to sort of deal with what's sometimes called the professional managerial class, which can sometimes not be all that much pro-worker. But whoever you get, particularly, as you get more into rural, but as you get more into red states, let me introduce the topic this way. And believe me, I'm not putting you on the spot or asking you to give me numbers or percentages or specifics from the conference, but I just want to bring it up that, for example, back in 2010, I think it was, I gave a speech in front of the Treasury Department at a big demonstration demanding that Goldman Sachs give back the $12 billion backdoor bailout it got through AIG. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, nothing you said couldn't be said at a Tea Party rally, because, it was anti-big bank, it was, left populist, but populist, to which I said, to the shock and surprise of some of my friends, invite me. I would go, and I would represent the left at a Tea Party rally if it came to that, which, by the way, I found out later was Bernie's attitude. So he would walk into a room of Trump voters, MAGA people, didn't matter. I wonder, to what extent people might have talked about, how to do that, or how to confront hostile voters, voters that to me are a natural consistency if we can constituency if we could break through the barrier, but who might be highly resistant at first. Do you get what I'm driving at?
I do get where you're driving at, and I do think that's a really important piece of the conversation. Obviously, there are some overlaps in terms of interests and focus points on where the problems are, and then of course there's some huge gaps, right?
Right.
That may or may not be bridgeable with different folks. I am sure that conversation was happening both in some of the program sessions and informally, which we definitely made sure to make space for during the course of the weekend. I will say I was running around a lot, doing a lot of background coordination and whatnot during the course of the conference. So I had certain conversations and not others. But I think that's naturally, especially as you said, for certain folks in terms of depending on where they're representing, that's naturally a big question and potentially a strategic area of, how they move forward, or maybe even part of how they got into office. And I think that a lot of our work and a lot of what I will learn from all these folks in office is as we move forward, we're really hoping to have even some, for example, regional breakouts where folks can continue these conversations, even, virtually, because not everyone can get together every day in person. Regional conversations around these questions, these strategic questions, also by, as you're saying, area or type of community. So, literally in part of our follow-up with folks, we're asking, do you characterize your area as suburban, rural, small city, large city, et cetera? Because we want to find where those overlaps are and where people need to have exactly the conversations and exactly figure out the kinds of questions that you just raised. And I feel like, my kind of starting point with a lot of this is, these folks have the answers to those questions more than any of us who haven't been in that lived position. As you said, I feel the same as you. Running for office requires a lot of tenacity, a lot of, a very tough skin. And, you really have to quickly develop a lot of skills in that kind of role. And I'm really, really looking forward to continuing to listen and learn from how they have been experiencing and answering those questions, and then also helping find resources that they can draw on for each other. So I can confidently say I'm sure those conversations were happening, even though I wasn't always right in the middle of them.
Okay. What about policy? Was there Were you aware of any specific policy ideas that were engaging people or that people were wrestling with, whether it's, minimum wage or healthcare or any of a number of other things, environment?
Yeah.
Either at the conference or maybe DSA Fund in general, were there any policies that you feel or felt were, key to these people in their roles?
Yes. Part of how we structured the weekend and which sessions we would have in such a limited time frame was soliciting what folks are working on. So there was a whole session around housing and moving housing policy.
Good.
Yeah, I wasn't able to be in the room for that one, so I'm really looking forward to kind of catching up and reading everything that came of it. But for each session we had folks in office who have been already kind of having some successes and moving things along in their respective regions, and then every single session kind of opened it up for everyone to talk to each other. And so housing was a major one. We also had one on climate action. That was another main focus that folks wanted to get together around. And another one was labor. both labor in the sense of working with unions and in the sense of working with unorganized workers as well. And I know in the labor session, which I got to sit in on more, there was a lot of talk about, for example, how do you work with both like more left unions as well as more conservative unions, right? We had such a huge breadth in the labor movement and in the history of the labor movement. And then also working with all these upstart, which is wonderful and amazing, all this upstart organizing that's been happening now in the last few years, whether it's gig workers, Starbucks, et cetera, that's, really taking off, graduate students, et cetera, and faculty, and, you keep going. So people were really talking about, okay, well, in my area, we've got, these workers over here who are coming from this place, these workers over here who are coming from this place, this, structure of longstanding, unions coming from this way. How do we work with, all these different interests or all these different kind of orientations, and still be able to move things forward? And, and folks are teaching each other literally in that room. Well, this is what happened where I was, or this is how we managed to bring some of those conversations together to, move, as you said, minimum wage in a certain area, or move the question of how are gig workers being treated, as well as the unionization questions around, so that's an example of how that focus was both important to everybody in the room, and how they're both impacted by it and impacting it, in their lived experience in office. So labor, climate action, housing were three of the big kind of issue-oriented sessions. And then there were also some kind of strategy-oriented sessions. But yeah, those were all hugely kind of popular, and people really wanted to be in the room for those conversations.
One of the things I really love about work like you're describing, Sunshine, is that we can't claim to believe in solidarity and workers' rights if we're not willing to learn and open ourselves to the feedback that comes from local politics, local organizing, local activism. And while, I'm very aware, for example, the housing issue, I've written on it and so on, the fact that it's, let's say, I'm not asking you to quantify this, but let's say it's in the top 3 or so, not necessarily so at the national left level, but it gives you a sense of what people in the local and regional areas are thinking about. And I think that's critically important. So first of all, thank you for that. And then I guess the next issue would be, how do I put this? Communications, maybe, or how to communicate these ideas to people, including whether or not to call yourself, for example, a socialist or democratic socialist, but more broadly, how to communicate these ideas in ways that people care about. Was there much discussion of that?
There was another session that I did not get to be present for, that was specifically around communicating with your constituents, and specifically around surveys that have been done around working class, issues, interests, where everyday, non-activists, non-elected folks are responding in terms of where they're at, what's important to them, how they think about talking about these questions, like you're saying, in terms of language and framework. So that was one of the strategy sessions that we had, which again, I didn't get to sit on. So I'm sorry that I can't give enough specifics, because it just happened 5 days ago. And so I haven't been brought up to speed on every single detail of every panel. But yeah, that was a key piece. And actually one of the other pieces that came up coming out of the weekend already, just hearing back informally from folks, is that, if we were to have a similar gathering again, folks would really love a session focused on media, in terms of, approaching media, speaking in media, how to engage with media, which we didn't have a session on in this particular time, but clearly that's linked to exactly what you're bringing up, how to be communicating both with constituents and via the media, right, to reach folks, both on the idea level and I think in the most practical and pragmatic levels. And yeah, I mean, again, we really want this to be a first step. And so as we go further along, if you bring myself or one of my colleagues back 6 months from now, a year from now, I'm sure we'll be able to speak in much more granular detail on all these different pieces that have come through and come together, and where those resources have been brought together, what exactly people are sharing and prioritizing. But yeah, in terms of the housing, just to go back for a second, clearly, I think we all know this in general anyway, it's a national problem,
Sure.
right? Every locality, every state is facing a huge housing crisis. We're all facing a huge climate crisis, right? In terms of labor, there's both, the overall decline in labor power from the last decades, but then this burgeoning activity in the last few years, and that's also across so many different areas. So I think it makes a lot of sense that those are focal points. And then, as you said, kind of how do folks talk about it? And yeah, I mean, different people, to what degree they really highlight and frame, hey, I'm a democratic socialist, and put that front and center does vary. People may or may not have critiques of that, right? But people are in different situations, and like one thing folks talked about who really are putting that more front and center, which I think unsurprisingly coincides with what kind of broader political climate their community operates in. But they were like, one of the real benefits of that is that it becomes harder to attack them necessarily, in the sense that if the right wants to say, oh, this person is a socialist, and then they're like, yeah, like I already told everybody, and I, still managed to get into office, and et cetera. And so obviously, these different strategies that people are using in terms of how they're communicating around that broader question of ideology and really, moving forward structurally in the world. And, a lot of times, even though people may be working on policies that we can't say are like upending the entire capitalist structure in every single policy, I think a lot of folks are coming from the perspective of, we want to make sure the policies are as structural as possible to move, advance the broader democratic socialist goal, the broader goal of democratic socialism, and countering and winning against capitalism as the prevailing framework for our lives, by, ensuring that if there's a policy, it's not just like, okay, we're changing this one little nice thing, but there's a structural element to it that's starting, that's changing power dynamics. So, that's, I think, where the intersection of vision and, commitment to ideological change can come together with these everyday, daily needs, changes, moving things one day at a time, 1 year at a time through like legislative sessions.
Yeah, I like to say that the problem with big corporations isn't that they're woke, it's that you're broke. And that's because of, the structure as it exists. And whether, if people don't want to call themselves democratic socialists, sometimes you can say, well, I just think government could do a lot more for people than it currently does. And we should take advantage of that. But housing is a perfect example of that. And I would think in terms of your work, educational work with the DSA fund, the whole response has been this sort of neoliberal response, if you will, has been, well, let's go after the NIMBYs, right? The NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and say, yes, in my backyard. Oh, no, maybe deregulation doesn't work because it relies on the free market. If you're saying people need more housing, which they clearly do, maybe the government should build it like it used to do. Maybe it should build the 10 million units that the Kerner Commission suggested in 1969. You get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I definitely do. And, we really want to support both electeds in office, and also, we did a series of, virtual events over the past year leading up to this conference, where we brought together folks in office with organizers in the DSA chapters where they are, to share examples of working together, right? Having an inside and outside strategy to move things, campaigns around housing, campaigns around worker rights, for example, were both themes of some of those panels where, a lot of times, some of the imperative was coming from, right, local chapters, organizers, leaders in the community. And then how do they work with elected officials? How do elected officials work with them? So, I also want to give credit and appreciate and emphasize, while this gathering was, focused on folks in office, because they also need kind of that support that's really focused on what they're going through day to day in government. But so much of the work can only happen, of course, in working with organizers across a broad, spectrum of DSA and also, allied interests and organizations. So, there's a lot of work to be done. And of course, being at the DSA Fund, we want to help folks and the movement at large become stronger as a democratic socialist movement in name, right? And we're acknowledging that folks are starting from different political climates, and how do we help and support and, sometimes push, right, especially from, organizers in local chapters and localities, to really move that democratic socialist framework, both in practical reality and in how we talk about things.
That's very well said. Before I let you go, where can people go to find out more, learn more, maybe participate?
Yes. So the website for the DSA Fund is fund.dsausa.org. So that's a general site to find us. We also have a Fund YouTube channel, which you can get through from there, that has a bunch of this virtual programming we've been doing over time, where folks can get into the more nitty gritty of both organizers and elected officials grappling with some of these questions that you raised today. Info@dsafund.org, a good email address for folks to reach out from various fronts. I would say those are the best ways to connect and reach out to us.
Okay, well, Sunshine Royanian Ludder, Deputy Director of the DSA Fund, thanks for all your great work, first of all, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Sure, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, and we look forward to continuing this work.
Absolutely. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.